Great, I think that we'll kick it off. Welcome everyone. I'm pleased to welcome you to our first webinar on farm environment planning. My name is Ailsa Robertson and I'm the Sustainability Extension Manager at Horticulture New Zealand, and I'll be facilitating this webinar. I would also like to welcome our three speakers, Lucy Deverall, Damien Farrelly and Andrew Barber, and I'll introduce them properly right before they speak. So this webinar is the first in a series on farm environment planning for horticulture growers. We're originally planning to offer this content through regional workshops. However, because of the uncertainty of COVID right now, we're delivering these important messages to you through these webinars. This webinar is recorded and will be posted on the HortNZ website. For those of you who are new to webinars or just need a quick refresher, members of the audience are automatically muted and we can't see you. So if you'd like to say something or ask a question, please do so using the question and answer function at the bottom of your panel. If you just hover your mouse over the bottom of your screen, it should come up. It should come up as Q&A. And if we don't have time to get through all of the questions, we'll respond by phone or email after the webinar. We've decided to start with a few questions for the audience. We'd like to know more about you, where you're from, and what you do. We'll then hear from our three speakers who will talk for roughly 10 minutes each. And after each speaker, I'll ask a couple of questions relating to that topic. And then if there are additional questions, we'll get to them at the end if we can. I'd like to ask you three questions using the Zoom polling function. The questions will appear on your screen. Just keep scrolling down to the final one. And I'll give you about 20 or so seconds to get through them. And you can select multiple answers if they apply to you. Okay, here we go. They should appear on your screen now. Excellent, getting some good results coming through. I think we might call it there. There's a few more answers. Hang on a second. Okay, I might end the polling in about 10 seconds. Okay, ending the polling. Great, we've got about half of the respondents, so that's great. I don't know if you can see the answers there, but we have about 47% of the audience are growers, 60% are from the horticulture industry. Well, these don't quite add up. Maybe you've selected more than one. About 7% are other primary industry and 30% are rural professional. And for those of you that are growers, about 27% were vegetable growers, 33% fruit, 7% indoor, and we don't have any arable growers today. 13% said they have just a single site, and 27% that said they had a multi-site enterprise. And we have growers from a big proportion of growers from Auckland, Waikato, a few from Northland, Bay of Plenty, Gisborne, Hawke's Bay, Taranaki, Wanganui, Manawatu, Marlborough, Nelson, Tasman, Canterbury, Otago South, and we have all the regions covered. That's fantastic. Thank you for participating in that poll. It's great to see such a diverse audience attending today. Oh, I can share the results. Sorry about that. Just give you a bit of a view of what came through. I'll now move on to our first speaker, Lucy. And I'll just allow her to have control over the slides. So Lucy is Horticulture New Zealand's Environmental Policy Advisor for the North Island. Lucy will talk us through the new legislation relating to farm environment plans and the RMA. If you have any questions for Lucy during her presentation, please use the Q&A function at the bottom, as I mentioned. Lucy, over to you.
Right. Hi, everybody. I generally, some of you may not know me, I generally cover the Northland, Auckland and Waikato regions. My presentation isn't going to be what are the rules, it's more of a how do farm environment plans fit into the bigger planning picture and the relationship between the Resource Management Act and regional plans. So how these are going to start filtering through for you. Just a quick note on terminology. The title of my presentation states freshwater farm plans. That's what the Resource Management Act refers to. I will be using farm environment plan as that's what it's been called previously, and the two terms are used interchangeably by a lot of different councils and by central government agencies.
Lucy, that poll is still up. I don't know if you can get rid of that.
It's not up on my screen, sorry.
Oh, it is on mine. I don't know. Yeah.
Oh,
look at that. Beautiful. Thank you.
Brilliant. I'm also struggling to, Ailsa, I can't actually move the slides. There you go. All right. So this first slide is a very high level overview of all the changes that have come through sorry about that, technical difficulties. So yes, a high level overview of all the changes that have come about mid-2020 to address healthy waterways. You'll see in the corner here, I've got a list of common abbreviations. When I'm talking, I'll try not to use those abbreviations. Apologies if I do, but there they are for a reference. So the National Policy Statement on Freshwater Management is the overarching document. All these other documents and amendments and changes that have happened, they're all intended to assist in achieving the National Policy Statement. So the National Policy Statement sets a long-term vision for the health of freshwater and freshwater ecosystems. It does this by directing councils on ways of managing water quality and quantity. This includes setting bottom lines for water quality at which catchments must be brought up to or maintained at. Regional councils are required to address the National Policy Statement in their regional plans no later than December 2024. So that's only 4 years away. The National Policy Statement also allows regional councils to set stricter requirements or targets than what are already set at a national level. Very briefly, some of the other changes. A national environmental standards. These are the rules that apply nationwide for freshwater management. The most relevant for horticulture, there are some rules relating to setbacks from wetlands for vegetation clearance and land disturbance. As you can see, there are a range of changes that happen to the Resource Management Act. We're going to focus on farm environment plans. And the other relevant change was an amendment to water take metering regulations. So not going to cover those today. We'll have following webinars that will talk about those. So moving to the next slide, hopefully. Right, what are farm environment plans according to the Resource Management Act? Essentially, they are a tool to achieve the National Policy Statement. The template for how these will look, or even if there is a template, is still to come. But so far, the farm environment plans we've been dealing with, they are a map that identify all your land parcels associated with the farm, including leased land and owned land. And then also on the map, you identify any potential environmental risks and any actions that you will use to manage those risks. But Andrew and Damien will probably cover that off in more detail. The most important thing to note is that any actions that you need to apply. You don't have to undertake all those actions all at once. You can plan for time and budgets. That's the only way that these plans are going to become effective or successful. So the Resource Management Act does list a few points that farm environment plans need to cover. I've summarised them here in the slide. The most important is that any of the actions you decide to undertake in your farm environment plan, they must either comply with other relevant regulation, or if they don't comply, you need to have permission or consent to do so. Moving on. Next one is who. So who needs a farm environment plan? The Resource Management Act lists a range of thresholds for different agricultural activities, which I've listed in the slide. You'll see that horticulture is 5 hectares or more, or a combination, and actually there's an error in that last bullet point. It should actually specify 20 hectares or more of a combination of any 2 or more agricultural land uses. So an example would be, say you have 18 hectares of arable and 2 hectares of horticulture. Even though that 2 hectares of horticulture is less than that 5, you still need to get a farm environment plan for the whole thing. And the farm environment plans apply at an enterprise level. So all your owned land, your leased land, and it doesn't matter if they're not next to each other, it's the whole thing. So there's also a who is involved. The farm operator, so the person who with ultimate responsibility for operating the farm, as the term kind of implies. The best part about this is that the farm operator has responsibility of preparing the farm environment plan and recording any changes or amendments. So you choose what actions you need to take, and you are in charge of that. There are a couple of others involved. The certifier, who then confirms that the actions in the farm environment plan are likely to achieve the desired outcomes. And the auditor, moving on to the next slide, who is the person who audits the farm to make sure that you're actually complying with the actions or undertaking the actions that you intended to take, or if you're doing other actions that they're actually recorded in the farm environment plan. And then, of course, you've got regional council who are in charge of monitoring and enforcing those farm environment plans. So those are the key parties, and I've listed their key responsibilities in those slides, sort of who's in charge of what, but there's still a lot of detail, as I'll discuss, there's still a lot of detail around the full process around those and the criteria for those parties, each of those people who are involved. Oh, sorry, can we jump to the next slide? So how are you meant to get all this done? As I've mentioned, there's a lot of detail that still needs to come. The Resource Management Act has a list that indicates more regulation or direction is needed in terms of the content. So it might be that actually they specify what methods or thresholds apply, the timeframes between preparing your FEP to getting it certified and getting it audited. And importantly, still to come is the criteria for who is a certifier and who is an auditor. At a regional council level, there's a whole lot still to come as well. As I mentioned, regional councils have to undertake plan changes to address the national policy statement, and they're also able to have stricter controls. So that will also impact what your farm environment plan looks like and what actions you then choose to apply. So going back to the other slide, the when. When does this all need to happen by? Are we able to go back one? So you need to start preparing your farm environment plan now. I know that I said that the councils don't have to make changes. Well, they have to have made changes by 2024. But all regional councils as I mentioned, they all have to have those changes in by 2024. The Resource Management Act makes farm environment plans a mandatory tool to achieve national policy statements. So you'll actually see that the farm environment plans will be a part of those plan changes, and they'll be a requirement. Some councils are going to move a lot faster. A lot of them already have a lot of detail already prepared, getting ready. So they will come out before 2024. As pointed out in the slide, you'll see that once those proposed rules and that plan change are out in the public arena, those rules will apply and can be enforced. And if you've already got your farm environment plan ready, it will be a lot quicker and easier to respond to those changes than it would be from starting from scratch. So that kind of gets to where I wrap up with my presentation. I see that there is one question.
Yeah, thank you, Lucy. We had one question, but it doesn't relate to your speech. However, if you do have questions for Lucy, I will return to those at the end of the presentation after Andrew's talk. So we'll move on. Thank you, Lucy, for that presentation. Our next speaker is Damien Farrelly. Damien is the manager of New Zealand GAP scheme and also the food safety manager at Horticulture New Zealand. So Damien will discuss farm environment planning in relation to the GAP schemes and touch on audit and certification. Damien, you now should have control.
Thank you, Ailsa. Let's see if it works. That wasn't good. Can't see the... Doesn't want me to go full screen. Can you hit the presentation button?
Yep, sure.
Oh, maybe I should be able to just do it here. The current slide. Try again. Yay. All right. Thank you, Ailsa. So as discussed, I'm the manager of the NZGAP scheme, and my presentation will focus on NZGAP and on the farm environment plan pathway we've got via the EMS add-on. So, sorry, just to give an overview of NZGAP certification. Certification of the safe and sustainable production of fruit and vegetables in New Zealand. Very similar to Global GAP certification, except with a New Zealand focus. And the three main areas that we cover are food safety, environment, and social practice. And this presentation will be focused on the environment area, which is supporting development, implementation of sustainable farming practices, including soil, water, and natural resources. In future, we'll be looking at emissions as well, but that is out of scope for today's presentation. Just quickly looking at the drivers for certification, growers be well aware of these, market being the primary driver on the right-hand side. So without certification, almost no market access for growers domestically or for export. Things like quality, taste, and variety are very much for individual growers. It's not something that's covered by GAP certification. It's about having a good product. But where certification really comes in is around the claims. So provenance, is it New Zealand produce, meeting certain quality standards, which are generally set by the markets. And then the key areas for certification around safety, sustainability, and ethically sourced. So markets generally have responsible sourcing policies, which are generally aligned between supermarkets, but GAP certification, from an NZGAP point of view, we make sure that the certification meets those various market drivers. And on the regulatory side, Food Act, all growers again will be well aware of the Food Act and how we've had recognition of NZGAP and Global GAP there. And today the focus will be on the Resource Management Act, but other environmental legislation was that Zero Carbon Act, and then around social practice, employment, health and safety. Ultimately, meeting those regulatory issues will hopefully give growers access to land, water, nutrients, and labour. And so with the lens of environment, and it's very much driven by regulation at the moment through this Resource Management Act. But because of the market certification, growers are not starting from scratch. They have nutrient management plans and irrigation management plans that are components of farm environment plans. What we're doing here is really just expanding that and making it more comprehensive so that it meets the new requirements. So just a quick overview of certification in New Zealand horticulture. Been around for over 20 years, both NZGAP and Global GAP certification. NZGAP formerly VegFed and Global GAP formerly Europe GAP. The slides have gone off a little bit here in the fonts, but we're at a stage now where over 90% of production is certified, and that is primarily market driven because there is no market access without certification, and over 3,500 certified growers. Caveat around that number, it's around management units. So in fruit sector primarily, kiwi fruit, avocados, growers can come together under one management system. So that 3,500 certification units translates potentially across to about 5,000 certified growers. It's an integrated assurance framework. Both NZGAP and Global GAP cover multiple issues in that one certification scheme, as outlined in the previous slide. Recognised by markets worldwide, endorsed by regulators or formally recognised, and a credibility component is that they're all independently audited. Just to look at NZGAP and Global GAP in comparison, around 1,600 growers in NZGAP certify all crops and increasing numbers, things like hops that are not outside of the normal fruit and vegetable scope, but we don't certify the kiwi fruit because they're all certified under Zespri. And under Global GAP, around 2,000 growers, and almost 1,800 of those are between the two big grower groups in kiwi fruit and avocados, being Zespri and Avoco. Difference between NZGAP and Global GAP is where the head office is, Global GAP being over in Germany, but we do have a technical working group in New Zealand that helps to align Global GAP with local requirements, and that's the pathway that was used to get recognition for the Food Act. So Global GAP, as the name suggests, is globally recognised, and especially recognised by those EU retailers because of that European centric. Looking at the assurance framework then, quite complicated diagrams, but I'll step us through it. Growers are in the centre of this, where implementation of GAP occurs. And a new area that we're looking at now is support for certification with the endorsement of advisors scheme. That is likely to translate into the national certification scheme if required under the Resource Management Act, but this is our interim measure. And there are a range of crop-specific tools that growers can use also. Stepping through the rest of the diagram, the first thing we do, developing a standard, the EMS being the standard we're talking about today, is that it's benchmarked to relevant requirements, whether it's regulation or market, and the content is very much based on the industry codes of practice. So nutrient management, soil management, irrigation, NZGAP doesn't develop those standards. It's very much based on what's out there and based on the latest research. And then within those guidelines, there are crop-specific guidelines. So while GAP can be generic across all horticulture, individual product groups might develop their own guidelines. Say it's nutrient management, this is the crop demand for nutrients, and that's very crop-specific. So that fits in under the GAP assurance framework also. So once we've got a standard that's benchmarked to the requirements, we seek recognition with regulators and supermarkets. And if there isn't an official recognition pathway, we can still seek endorsement, which is something that we do. The credibility of the system is very much around those third-party audits. If we go look back to the center around the types of certificate holders we have individual growers, multi-sites, and big enterprises, and also pack houses who manage a number of sites. And then grower groups, Zespri being an example of a grower group, but NZGAP has a number of those also. So the independent audit happens at that level. And then there's internal inspections within those multi-sites and grower groups especially. So that's a very key thing for NZGAP is we're not saying growers are meeting the standards, we're using third-party audits to verify that growers meet the standards. A a word used by growers, and NZGAP has teeth, meaning that if there are any issues identified, growers have to correct them. If they don't correct them, then their certification gets suspended and can be cancelled. And if certification is cancelled, growers have to be re-audited to get back into the system. So it's quite an exclusive club and gives trust and assurance to regulators and supermarkets that NZGAP isn't hiding any issues, that growers really have to be able to meet the requirements and demonstrate compliance. Moving on to the EMS in a bit more detail now. Like outlined in the previous slide, it is based on the industry guidelines and codes of practice, and the research that developed those codes of practice is very much industry funded. In terms of integration, a grower who is NZGAP or NZGAP Global Gap equivalent or Global Gap certified can attain registration and certification to the EMS add-on. And while there are components of environment in NZGAP and more so in Global Gap, the EMS goes that extra mile that's expected to meet the regulatory requirements. So even if you're Global Gap certified, not likely to meet the council requirements for farm environment plans. So those guidelines are very much around the practices, which is what growers would generally be used to with GAP certification. It's all about good practice or good agricultural practice. When it comes to the models in councils have quite a big focus on being able to measure your losses from your system, and nutrient management been a very key focus for those. So the EMS integrates with those as well. So whether a grower uses Overseer or a tool like Landwise or many other crop tools that are out there, crop calculators, that can be audited as part of the EMS process to ensure growers really know the nutrients that they're using and the risk that they could be losing nutrients from the system. In terms of recognition, it meets regulatory requirements for certified and audited farm environment plans, and we have formal recognition in Canterbury, and that we have plans to be recognised as certified freshwater plan pathway for growers under Section 9A of the Resource Management Act. So that's the amendment that Lucy has mentioned earlier. Unknown at the moment what the detail of that is going to look like, but now the election is over, we expect some detail to come out through the development of the regulations. And for those that are familiar with the Food Act, I probably say we're about 8 to 10 years behind in that journey in terms of what it would mean for GAP certification and how it aligns with the regulation. So we've got a system that meets the requirements, similar to what we had with the Food Act for NZGAP and Global Gap 10 years ago. And now it's about making sure that that existing system is recognised and, if needed, tweaked to meet the new requirements. The content of the EMS, we've got management areas across these 5, soil, nutrients, irrigation, waterways and biodiversity. And we'll be looking to add an emissions module for climate change and measurement of ag emissions. That is currently being developed. So what does regulatory recognition mean? So in Canterbury, NZGAP has that formal recognition. It is the only council that has a formal recognition pathway. Waikato might have when that plan gets notified. But it's basically looking at NZGAP taking on that role of monitoring grower registrations and certifications and verification of their farm environment plans. And then only those that cannot meet the EMS would be dealt with by the council through that escalation or deregistration process. And so through that recognition process, we've got recognition of the actual template for the farm environment plan, and then the assurance system, including the GAP auditors. What that means is if you're NZGAP or Global Gap certified and you sign up for the EMS, then the EMS can be audited on the same day or aligned in line with your current GAP certification. So that is the primary aim there, being to minimize costs for growers and to deliver on that integrated effective system, not just in terms of the standards, but also the implementation with the auditors. So we're in policy discussions in a number of regions. Just had hearings yesterday in Horizons, in Palmerston North, and they are unlikely to have a formal recognition pathway for something like the EMS. However, we are getting recognition of the nutrient management system within that, so that if a grower has used the EMS and they can demonstrate that they meet the council requirements, then they can use the EMS as part of their consent application. So just to look at how we align with the council requirements, every regional plan has a section on farm environment plans and says this is what a farm environment plan must have in it. So what NZGAP has done in the back end is benchmark the requirements from the regional plan across with the EMS. So on the left hand side here, you see an example from Canterbury, their farm environment plan schedule. And then on the right hand side, we've added in all the EMS control points that align with that objective or requirement. And if you open up this regional guide in Canterbury, you'll see some areas that are highlighted in yellow, and that's because it's quite specific for that region. So if you look at nutrients at the bottom there, they're talking about being below baseline good management practice loss rate. That is a very ECAN-centric requirement. So rather than putting it into the EMS and a grower from Northland seeing something that's very ECAN-centric, we've developed a question that is around meeting, a generic question about meeting the regulatory requirements. And then if you come to this regional guide, you can see something highlighted in yellow, then it's probably something that's a little bit different in your region. So this regional guide is really useful for growers and for auditors to focus on the bits that are tailored for a particular region. And when the Resource Management Act is amended, it's likely that there will be more alignment across all regions about the content of a farm environment plan. So the need for a regional guide will be negated. So I'm very hopeful for that. But at the moment, this is an interim guide, an interim measure to ensure that growers can align with the council requirements, rather than having a different template in every region, which some other sectors have done. They've just developed a new farm environment plan template for every region, which we see as quite confusing and unnecessary with a national system, but it's regionally specific using this regional guide. So where the EMS fits into the bigger picture, the requirements for an audited farm environment plan are pretty universal, and now with the amendment of the Resource Management Act will be required by all growers. So using that, plus having a nutrient budget of some sort, and while they're supposed to be looking at nutrients and soil, phosphorus, nitrogen, phosphorus, E. coli, and sediment, the big focus is on nutrients around the country. So when it comes to operating within environmental limits, it's likely that nutrients is the one that growers are going to have a nutrient budget for. So the EMS plus that demonstrating you're operating within some sort of parameters will enable, in some cases, for growers to get a consent if they need, or having those first two components in place demonstrates that you're a permitted activity. And essentially under the Resource Management Act, that's supposed to mean that you have a social license to operate. Not necessarily true, but the reality is that without doing these things, and your operation may be non-compliant and subject to enforcement. So my last slide here on implementation. So the EMS, we have just 70 registrations so far, so a long way to go, but we've got a lot of big growers who have signed up so far. So over 14,000 hectares have been covered, and just 8 growers certified since audits started in properly in the last couple of months. I've given an example here on the right for the Lake Horticulture catchment, where we just had our hearings yesterday. And what we're doing is, and Andrew Barber will talk about this a little bit more, is aggregating information from collections of growers to be able to demonstrate to council how much progress growers are actually making. So rather than it being an individual thing where each grower is explaining themselves to the council, with something like this for mapping, we can demonstrate all of this area in green are those that are compliant with the regional plan, and actually a lot of those that are in yellow are not actually horticulture, aren't actually growing vegetables. They're just identified as cropping land, so it may be arable or it could be winter feed. So there's probably only 1 or 2 growers on this graph that haven't registered for the EMS so far. So at that aggregated level, being able to demonstrate to council that growers are proactive and meeting the requirements is actually a really good story for the industry to be able to tell, because down the line, if when new policy is developed, the more trust and the more credibility the industry has, the better chance we have of getting consenting pathways and policy that will actually work for horticulture. that is the end of my presentation. We do have a couple of questions here. So first one is about, is the EMS something that growers can use themselves or enlist a consultant to do for them? So the EMS has been developed for growers to be able to use themselves, and recognize that some growers are busy and some aren't necessarily experts in this area. So a lot have been using consultants, but it's not mandatory. So if a grower has the know-how and the capacity to do it themselves, and they absolutely can, but would probably recommend that they use a consultant to make sure that they get it right first time, because if you don't get it right, then you can get non-compliances in the audit, and that can add costs. So recommend using consultants, and from the endorsed advisor process, we will have those available on the public register. And the next question is about, will all growers be required to use the EMS, or would another template be accepted and allowed? So the EMS, I think Andrew has a slide on this about how it interacts with templates. The EMS is the audit, and we have templates developed that interact directly with that audit, so they're best aligned with the EMS add-on. But technically any farm environment plan template would fit into the system, and that's up to the grower themselves. If they're part of an irrigation scheme or a consultant has already developed a farm environment plan, that's absolutely fine. It can be audited by the EMS. And the only caveat there is that there are aspects of the EMS that are stronger than a lot of the default templates out there. And I would say erosion and sediment control being a key one. And then nutrient management and vegetable growing, it's quite tailored in the EMS. So the answer is you can use another template. It just might not completely meet the EMS audit requirements. And then in terms of complying with the requirements, growers can use NZGAP, or they can go direct to the council if that's an option that's made available. And that's similar to where we are with Food Act at the moment. I think that's the last question. It's percentage of individual growers to grower groups. So there are 1,600 growers in NZGAP, 1,100 of those are individuals, so around 500 in grower groups, so almost a third in grower groups. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. Any further questions, just send them through afterwards.
Excellent, thank you, Damien. Our final speaker is Andrew Barber. Andrew is the director of the professional consultancy called AgriLink, and I'm sure many of you will know him by face, if not his name and reputation preceding him. And Andrew will talk about the how of farm environment plans and the EMS add-on and the industry approach. Andrew, you now should have control.
Oh, that's scary. Very good. Thank you very much, Ailsa. Yeah, so what I'd like to do, as this is kind of the first webinar, is just kind of place farm environment plans within the whole system. Gosh, we've been talking about farm environment plans for a very long time, and what we've tried to do is describe in this diagram here an industry approach, which we've sort of termed joining the dots. And so this whole concept over the years of how do you go from problem recognition all the way through to actually getting stuff done. And so this process links all the way through, and kind of the missing aspect for a long time, for many years, has been the farm environment plans. And I'll touch on that shortly about just how I think that helps get stuff done. Right, Ailsa, you're going to move the slide, I think. Oh, look at that. There you go. Problem recognition. So look, absolutely, without any question, if there isn't a recognition of the problem, then there's absolutely no incentive to, one, look for solutions, and two, implement solutions. So without any question, the first aspect to consider is problem recognition. And look, when it comes to things like erosion, that's reasonably easy to identify because you can see it. It's in your face, and that's kind of what what that first picture shows is a whole lot of scouring. Problem recognition around things like nutrient leaching can be harder to identify, and that picture on the right there is a lake. So obviously a lake with some eutrophication, and yeah, it can be further away, harder to identify back to the source of the problem. Albeit I put that picture up a few years ago, and that poor swan was blamed for all that eutrophication. So like I say, problem identification is the first step. Next slide. The horticultural industry, well, quite frankly, the primary industry is really, really good at doing research, and that underpins so much of the work that then flows through the whole industry. And so, what's really important about that research is it's ongoing. And so we often talk about good practices, good management practices, and best management practices. But ultimately, a lot of that has come out of really good research, either be that through Crown Research Institutes or the growers themselves. And I think that's one of the really good aspects that's come out of the Sustainable Farming Fund, is that a lot of this research is very grower focused and driven. So obviously the horticultural industry does a whole lot of that work, and whether that's seminars and monitoring, and the example there is some monitoring on some vegetative buffer strips. So, but that fits into the whole scheme. So that's where research fits past once the problem's been recognised. Next slide, please. The thing about research is that it then needs to get converted into grower talk and guidelines, and absolutely that's what underpins the next part, which is the farm environment plan. So these codes of practice come out of the research. Invariably, these codes come out on the 30th of June, because that's the deadline for for delivering a certain research project. But what's nice now about the farm environment plans is they link right back to these codes of practice. So when there's an issue, when you come to a question in the farm environment plan, there's a link straight back to these codes of practice. And I can't kind of overemphasize the importance of these, because they are industry driven and industry solutions. Otherwise you have things just imposed. So yeah, problem recognition, research, and then industry controlled codes of practice that are then linked through the farm environment plans. Next slide, please. So the farm environment plans are, in my opinion, what pulls all of this together. So we often had you come out of these research projects and you produce these codes of practice, and they might be 100 pages and nobody reads that, and then they might become 10-page consolidated and very few people read that. But the thing is with the is that if people aren't reading these practices and aren't thinking about it, then there's very little implementation, or only some people implement it. And what is really good about the farm environment plans is it actually creates an action plan to get the things done. So it links to these codes, it links to good and best practice, and it actually creates a structure. So you'll see in this diagram is that what Damien's already talked about with regards to the third-party auditing sits at the top, and under that is the farm environment plan itself. So the templates, and each of these templates, either the NZGAP template itself, or as that previous question asked, any other template that can be linked back and answer questions in the auditor's checklist. But the way we've developed the templates within NZGAP, they all follow the same. Process, whether it's soil, nitrogen, biodiversity. They all follow the same process. There's a risk assessment. Under that risk assessment, you then select from a toolbox of good management practices or best management practices, and then where there's a gap, there's a requirement to put in an action. So, for example, if you've selected a particular practice that you're not doing, then the farm environment plan goes, okay, well, I'm going to either investigate that, or I'm going to do some implementation of that, and I'm going to do it by, I don't know, December 2021. And what happens with the farm environment plan, and I talk to people about this plan being kind of 19 pages of going through these practices, pretty much consolidates then down to one page, which is your action plans. And that's what the auditors will then come back to and assess progress against in subsequent audits. But ultimately, a farm environment plan is just, quite frankly, a piece of paper, but what it drives and why it's absolutely crucial is it drives implementation and creates that structure. So next slide, please. Implementation. So at the end of the day, it comes down to what's happening on the ground, what's actually happening, and what are the practices. So no amount of models and no amount of talking is going to change stuff if it doesn't happen on the ground. And so the whole industry approach is very much focused on driving implementation. Those pictures that I show on the right is an example of a vegetative buffer strip. So pre implementation of that buffer strip in November 2015, through to installing it and getting the installation right. So if you don't get the practice right, and that's the example there of a buffer strip, is you might just end up with a 5 meter nice green strip of grass. So the codes of practice collect a whole lot of grower experiences and a whole lot of recommended ways of doing things. And so you'll see that picture at the bottom, on the bottom right, is once the grass, it's the same paddock all the way through, has been fully established. You know, it's got the right width. It doesn't have channelization. You know, you can see that top picture shows the ground was contoured to start with. But it's a really good example of doing implementation, but doing implementation correctly. Last slide, please, Ailsa. So this is just to, this is again, implementation. So I showed the vegetative buffer strips before, and this is the implementation of a sediment retention pond. Again, nice and visual, but just an example that these things, or all the implementation invariably is expensive. Either, well, it's got a cost, either in time or money. But the great thing about a farm environment plan, from my perspective, is that it's all about setting out a time frame for implementation. So it might well be that you've done the risk assessment, a particular paddock has got a high risk, and so quite frankly, you just get in there and the actions, be it a vegetative buffer strip, for example, in a vegetable situation, or a SRP, sediment retention pond, is installed within the next 6 months. It might well be that you've got a whole lot of other paddocks, and then you just stage out the implementation of various measures. So again, the farm environment plans are just a good way of, I don't know, not procrastinating, getting over that procrastination, that there is a plan in place, you can prove it to the council, and consequently you can prove it to the auditors, because they'll come back and check the progress. And I think that's pretty much me, Ailsa. Damien mentioned a little bit about, and I haven't touched on it in these slides because I knew I'd run out of time, is about metrics. But metrics and reporting is a whole awesome development that the industry is working on, and that can possibly be in a future webinar. Over and out. Thank
you very much, Andrew. And we don't have any new questions that have come through. I'll just start my wrap up, and if
possibly because I just answered everything.
Yeah, well, that's potentially, yes. If there are any questions that come through, I'll capture them at the end. I will take control back from you, Andrew. Or if you can go to the next slide, there we go. So how can you get started on your farm environment plan? The first step is to register for the EMS add-on through the NZGAP website. This slide shows all of the steps in the process, from registration at number 1 all the way through to audit at number 8, and then continuous improvement after that, or actions beyond your first audit. So after you register, you'll receive instructions on how to map your farm. So that's step number 3. And then it's a matter of working through the farm environment plan template, answering questions on how you manage soil and erosion control, nutrient management, and irrigation and biodiversity. And the final step before the audit is to complete the self-assessment checklist, which is also the audit checklist. So you're preparing for your audit through that process. And there are experienced advisors like Andrew Barber that can help you develop your farm environment plan. And as Damien said, that there will be an endorsed advisor program that's going to be launched. So all those advisors on the call, I encourage you to apply. And if you have any questions, please get in touch with NZGAP or HortNZ. And I don't think we've had any other questions come through.
Well, that's so disappointing.
What was that, sorry?
So disappointed.
Well, feel free to email any questions that you have if you think of them later. That's all we have time for today, and thank you very much for your time and participation in the poll, and we hope you found it useful. We will offer some more webinars over the coming months on how to prepare a farm environment plan in a bit more detail in those technical areas of soil, nutrient, irrigation and biodiversity. So please look for updates through the HortNZ newsletter. As I said, this webinar has been recorded and will also be put on the HortNZ website. I'll now close the webinar, and there are 2 short survey questions will pop up after I've closed it, asking you if you found it useful and if you'd like to hear about something else specific. And also, as Lucy mentioned, there will be planning and RMA series of webinars on those specific topics as well. So we're hoping that we can cover a lot of the questions that you might have there. Thank you very much, and thank you again to our speakers for providing a really great detailed content and overview, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. I'll end the webinar now.